My name is Elsie Bates. I'm 32 years old and a captain in the United States Navy. Today, I'm standing in Portsmouth Family Court, not as an officer, but as a defendant. The plaintiffs? The same parents who haven't called me in 12 years. My father, Robert, lets out a little chuckle. My mother, Margaret, shakes her head, whispering to her lawyer that my dress uniform looks ridiculous. They are suing me, trying to take the house my grandfather left me, claiming abandonment. Abandonment. I just got back from a 9-month deployment. My knee still aches from an IED fragment in Yemen, and this filing, it calls me an irresponsible child. You think wearing that thing is going to scare anyone? My father had snarled when he saw me in the hall. They think they're dragging me to court to humiliate me. They don't know that I came here to introduce myself. If you've ever had your own family deny your every effort, been called a failure just because you chose a different path, let me know where you're watching from. Hit the like button and get ready for a story about the price of honor. The Waffle House off the I-264 was an assault on the senses, but it was a welcome one. It smelled of America. The air was thick with the scent of burnt coffee, sizzling bacon, and the cloying sweetness of maple syrup clinging to everything. I was sitting in a cracked yellow vinyl booth, the fluorescent lights overhead humming a tune of comforting normalcy. This was my tradition. Coming home, truly coming home, meant a plate of peanut butter waffles and black coffee. It was the first meal I always had on American soil, a small ritual to wash away the dust of faraway places. My left knee sent a dull, throbbing ache up my leg from under the table, a permanent souvenir from a roadside in Yemen. I was bone-tired, the kind of exhaustion that settles deep in your marrow after 9 months of sleeping on ship decks, dirt floors, and the vibrating metal shell of a Black Hawk. But I was home. The steady clatter of cutlery, the low murmur of conversations, the waitress calling everyone "hon." It was the chaotic, beautiful sound of a world that was safe. "You sure you don't want any syrup with that, hun?" the waitress asked, holding up a sticky bottle of what the label called light syrup. I managed a tired smile. "No thanks, the peanut butter is all I need." I was trying to explain that the combination was a legacy from my grandfather when my phone vibrated against the tabletop, a low buzz that cut through the diner's noise. I glanced down. It was an email from a law firm I'd never heard of, Sterling and Finch. The subject line was cold and impersonal. Case file 4238B, immediate response required. Spam, I thought, probably some phishing attempt. I almost deleted it, my thumb hovering over the screen. But some ingrained sense of duty, made me open it. As the PDF loaded, the cheerful noise of the Waffle House seemed to recede, the sounds stretching and fading until there was only a dull ringing in my ears. The document was dense with dry legal language that felt alien. But 2 names jumped out from the top of the first page, stark and clear against the white background. Plaintiffs, Robert and Margaret Bates. Defendant, Captain Elsie Bates. My heart didn't race, it stopped. For one long, silent beat, I forgot how to breathe. I scanned the page, my eyes tripping over the words. Petition for partition of property. Due to dereliction of duty and abandonment by the defendant. Abandonment, that word. It was repeated 3 times on the first page alone, a legal hammer striking the same bruised spot over and over. They claimed I had abandoned my grandfather's house, that I hadn't fulfilled my responsibilities as the heir. I stared down at my waffles, now lukewarm, the peanut butter starting to congeal. Abandoned? For the last 9 months, my world had been confined to sand-colored landscapes and the gray steel of a naval vessel. I hadn't abandoned anything. I was serving my country. I was fulfilling my duty. The property taxes were paid, automatically deducted from my Navy salary every year like clockwork. The bills for the new roof I'd arranged for 2 years ago, and the plumber I'd hired from a satellite phone to fix a burst pipe last winter, all paid in full. I let out a sound, a short, sharp laugh devoid of any humor. It was the laugh of a soldier who'd just been told the real war was waiting back home. The waitress glanced over, her expression a mixture of concern and confusion. I just shook my head, my eyes still glued to the screen. My first instinct, my training, screamed at me to analyze the threat, to form a strategy. But this wasn't an enemy I could flank. This was my own blood. My hand, steady even under fire, trembled slightly as I found my brother's contact. Ryan, the golden child. The one who stayed in Portsmouth, who worked a real job selling insurance, who never disappointed them. He picked up on the third ring. Elsie, long time. What's up? His voice was distant, laced with the casual indifference of someone who was merely inconvenienced by the call. Ryan, Mom and Dad are suing me, I said, the words feeling like gravel in my mouth. Over Grandpa's farm. There was a pause on the other end of the line, not a shocked silence, a knowing one. Yeah, I heard about it, he finally said, his tone flat. He'd heard, he knew, and he hadn't called. Look, they're just saying you never come home, that the place is falling apart. Besides, they need the money. I need the money. You should do the right thing and just give it up. He never asked if I was okay. He never asked about Yemen. He never asked if I was home safe. The casual cruelty of it was a physical blow, sharper than any piece of shrapnel. The right thing? I whispered, the question hanging in the dead air between us. Yeah, the right thing, he repeated, as if explaining something to a child. Goodbye, Ryan. I ended the call before he could answer. Ryan's betrayal hurt more than the lawsuit. It was the confirmation of a truth I'd spent 12 years trying to outrun. I was utterly and completely alone. The cold fact of it settled in my chest, heavy as body armor. I remembered the day I enlisted, 12 years ago. My father, a man whose hands were perpetually stained with grease and whose worldview was forged in the unyielding steel of his auto shop, hadn't even looked at me. He just stood by his workbench, refusing to acknowledge the daughter who had shamed him. My mother, a woman who lived her life in the quiet shadow of his disapproval, sent me a single text message after I graduated from SEAL training. We raised a daughter, not a soldier. Don't embarrass this family. That was it. 12 years. Not a single phone call on Christmas. Not a card on my birthday. Not one word when I was laid up in a military hospital in Germany after the IED blast. They didn't call. They didn't text. They sued. This wasn't a spontaneous act of anger. It was a calculated, strategic strike. They wanted the last thing that connected me to my grandfather, the only person in that family who had ever truly seen me. But it was more than that. They didn't just want the house. They wanted to erase my legacy, and in doing so, erase me. My coffee was cold. My appetite was gone. I stared at my phone, at the unforgiving black letters on the screen. Case 4238B, Bates ver. Bates. Why did they want that house so badly? It wasn't a mansion. It wasn't some grand estate in the Virginia countryside. But as I drove away from the Waffle House, the legal papers feeling like a lead weight on the passenger seat, I knew the answer. I knew why a simple log house could ignite such a fire. It was because the house was his, and it was the only place I had ever felt like I belonged. Grandpa Edward's farm wasn't a property to me, it was a sanctuary. He built it himself, board by board, with the same steady hands that had served on a destroyer in the Pacific during World War II. It was a small, honest house, nestled among tall Virginia pines, and it always smelled of sawdust, pipe tobacco, and the quiet dignity of a man who understood the world in a way my own father never would. He was the anchor in the chaotic sea of my childhood. I remember being 10 years old, sitting on the porch swing with him on a warm summer evening. The cicadas were buzzing their relentless song in the trees. He pulled a small, heavy object from his pocket and placed it in my palm. It was his old Navy-issue compass, the brass casing worn smooth from years of use. "This world will try to make you lose your way, Elsie girl," he'd said, his rough, calloused hand closing over mine. His voice was a low, comforting rumble. "They'll tell you you're not fast enough, not smart enough, not girly enough." He gave me a slow wink, a twinkle in his clear blue eyes. "But none of that matters. All you need to know is your true north, your honor. That's the one direction that never, ever changes. Don't you let anyone else tell you who you are." He was the only person who never told me to act like a lady, who never flinched when I came home with skinned knees and a triumphant grin. He saw the fire in me, not as a flaw to be extinguished, but as a strength to be honed. He saw me. My father, Robert, saw things differently. To him, the world was a collection of tools and problems. Things were either useful or they were in the way. People were no different. When I was 17, I made the all-state basketball team. I was a starting forward, and I loved the fierce, controlled chaos of the game. My father never came to a single one. "Waste of time," he'd mutter, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. "Be better off learning how to weld." Then, during the regional finals, I went up for a rebound and came down hard. A sharp, cracking sound echoed in the gymnasium, followed by a searing pain in my left arm. My first thought wasn't about the pain. It was a cold dread of what my father would say. His first reaction at the hospital wasn't concern. It was contempt. He looked at the heavy plaster cast encasing my arm from wrist to elbow and sneered. "See? Told you so," he said, his voice dripping with grim satisfaction. "Now you're useless. Who's gonna marry a girl with arms like a man?" My mother just stood there beside him, silent. Her silence was always her answer. It was a quiet endorsement of his every judgment, his every dismissal of me. I drove myself home from the hospital that day, and I paid the ER bill myself with money I'd saved from scooping ice cream at the Dairy Queen all summer. That cast wasn't just plaster. It was a monument to the fact that, in my own family, I was on my own. That truth was carved deeper every day by the glaring favoritism shown to my brother, Ryan. He was the golden child, the one for whom the rules were always bent. When Ryan turned 18, he got drunk with his friends, wrapped the brand new Ford F-150 my parents had bought him around an oak tree, and got a DUI. My father's response? He yelled at the responding officer for scratching the paint on the wreck, then went out the next week and bought Ryan another truck. "A better one," he'd said, as if that would fix the problem. A few months later, when I turned 18, I wanted to go to a summer fitness camp. It was a prep program for kids interested in military careers. My father just laughed, a short, dismissive bark. "No money for that nonsense," he'd said, not even looking up from the engine he was working on. I had to get a second job waiting tables to pay for it myself. The injustice of it was a bitter pill. It was never just about the money. It was about worth. It was a daily, unspoken declaration that my ambitions were frivolous, while Ryan's mistakes were investments. I wasn't worth as much as he was. So when Grandpa Edward passed away, I wasn't surprised by what happened next. I was in the middle of basic training. I wasn't allowed to come home for the funeral. The first and only phone call I received from my parents during that entire time wasn't to offer comfort. It was to deliver a verdict. "The old man went crazy," my father's voice crackled over the payphone line. "He left you the farm." He was furious. My mother was audibly sighing in the background. They didn't understand. They saw it as a final act of senility, a foolish old man's whim. But I understood perfectly. In his final act of love, Grandpa Edward knew they would never value me. He knew they would see my path as a dead end. So he gave me a place to come back to. He gave me a true north, a legacy. And now they wanted to take that too. They weren't just suing me for a piece of property. They were trying to overturn his will. They were trying to tell the world, and me, that even my grandfather's faith in me was a mistake. If you've ever had one person in your life who believed in you when no one else would, please support this story by hitting the like button and in the comments. Just type the word grandpa or grandma or whoever that person was for you. Let's fill the comments with their memory. This isn't about a house. This is about honor. And I would not let them take it from me. Not now. Not ever. A few days before the court date, another email from their lawyer, Mr. Finch, landed in my inbox. The subject line read, "Settlement Offer." I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. It wasn't an offer. It was an ultimatum, wrapped in the deceptively polite language of the law. I read the words, my breath catching in my throat. Ms. Bates agrees to relinquish all claims to the property. In exchange, Mr. and Mrs. Robert Bates will agree not to pursue further claims for damages resulting from her irresponsibility. Ms. Bates, the formal address was a deliberate sting, a way to remind me that I was now an outsider. But it was the word irresponsibility that made the blood pound in my temples. They wanted me to sign a piece of paper that legally declared me irresponsible. They wanted a written confession to a crime I didn't commit. This wasn't about a house anymore. This was about submission. They didn't just want the farm. They wanted me to kneel. They wanted a victory on paper that they could show the whole town, proof that the rebellious daughter had finally been broken. My finger hovered over the reply button for a moment, a storm of angry, bitter words swirling in my mind. But I didn't type a single one. I simply moved the cursor to the trash icon and deleted the email. This battle wouldn't be won with angry words. It wouldn't end with a white flag of surrender. It would be decided in that courtroom, face to face. That evening, I stood in front of the small closet in my Norfolk apartment. The question I was facing wasn't about legal strategy or evidence. It was more fundamental than that. Who was I going to be when I walked into that courtroom? On one side of the closet hung my civilian life. Faded jeans, old navy t-shirts, a handful of simple dresses. If I wore one of those outfits, I would be walking in as Elsie, their daughter. And I knew exactly what they would see. They would look at me and see the ghost of the 17-year-old girl they'd scorned for a broken arm. They'd see the disappointment they'd carried for 12 years. By showing up as Elsie, I would be validating their narrative. That I was the lost, failed child who had run away from home. I would be playing a part in a play they had written for me. Then my eyes moved to the other side of the closet. Hanging pristine in a heavy-duty garment bag was my Navy service dress blue uniform. The deep, dark blue wool, the sharp creases, the gleaming gold buttons. It was more than just clothing. It was a testament. I wore that uniform the day I received my commission. I wore it the day I pinned a silver star to my chest. And I wore it the day I stood graveside and handed a folded American flag to the widow of a fallen teammate. Each thread was woven with duty, sacrifice, and an unwavering commitment to something larger than myself. It represented a life they refused to see, a person they refused to know. My mind drifted back to my first commanding officer, a good man we lost in the mountains of Afghanistan. I remembered standing before him after I'd finally made it through the hellish crucible of SEAL qualification training. He was a man of few words, but the ones he chose always landed with the weight of truth. Bates, he'd said, his gaze steady and clear. They're never going to get you. The people back home. They'll look at you and see something that doesn't fit into their neat little boxes. Don't you ever waste a second of your life worrying about that. He paused, letting the words sink in. Your honor. It isn't something people give you. It's the courage to show up as exactly who you are, especially when it makes them uncomfortable. His words echoed in my silent apartment, a voice from the past guiding my present. This wasn't about intimidating them. It wasn't about showing off. This was about correcting the record. This was about telling the truth. For 12 years, they had told a story about me to anyone in our small town who would listen. The story of Elsie, the girl who ran off to play soldier. The girl who was a shame, a disappointment. They had controlled that narrative for more than a decade, shaping my identity in my absence. This uniform. This was 12 years of truth. It was the deployments to places they only saw on the news. It was the sleepless nights on watch. It was the ache in my bones, the scars on my body. It was the silver star for valor. It was the purple heart for wounds received in action. It was the weight of command and the unbreakable bond of brotherhood. It was everything I had become while they were busy telling everyone what I wasn't. The decision settled over me, not with a clash of emotion, but with a quiet, cold clarity. You have to define yourself before others have the chance to define you incorrectly. I reached into the closet and unzipped the garment bag. The scent of clean, pressed wool filled the air. I laid the uniform out on my bed. With methodical precision, I began my preparations. I ironed out the smallest wrinkle from the jacket. I took a soft cloth and polished every single brass button until it shone like gold. I carefully pinned my ribbons over the left breast pocket, a colorful, silent summary of my service. I wasn't going to court to fight my family. I was going to introduce myself. Once and for all. The night before the hearing, I didn't stay in my Norfolk apartment. The four walls felt like they were closing in on me. Instead, I drove out to the farm. As I pulled down the long gravel driveway, the house looked dark and lonely under the moonlight, a silhouette of memory against the starry Virginia sky. It was cold inside, carrying the damp, musty smell of a place that had been sleeping for too long. I didn't bother with the lights. I just went out to the porch, my grandfather's porch, and sat on the top step. My old German shepherd, Knox, padded out after me and rested his graying head on my injured knee, letting out a soft groan. The silence out here was different from the quiet of my apartment. It was a deep, heavy silence, filled with the chirping of crickets and the weight of the coming day. Tomorrow, I would walk into a courtroom and face my own parents as adversaries. I had my evidence organized in a neat folder. I had my uniform pressed and ready. I had my strategy. But I wasn't prepared for this feeling, a profound sense of feeling orphaned, even though they were both still alive just a few miles down the road. Knox whined again, a low rumble in his chest, as if he could sense the turmoil inside me. I buried my face in the thick fur of his neck, the familiar scent of him a small comfort in the vast darkness. "It's just you and me, old boy," I whispered into his coat. "Just you and me." For a moment, behind the ironclad resolve I had built for myself, I felt fragile. I felt utterly alone. That's when my phone pinged. The sudden sound cut through the quiet night, sharp and intrusive. I pulled it out, assuming it was a late-night email from my own legal counsel. But the name on the screen wasn't a lawyer. It was Sergeant First Class Mongo Alvarez, the biggest, scariest-looking man on my team, and the closest thing I had to a brother. The text was short and to the point. "Boss, heard you got some family trouble." A small, tired smile touched my lips. News in the SEAL community travels faster than a wildfire. It was a closed circuit of trust and gossip, and nothing stayed secret for long. I typed back, my fingers moving slowly in the cold air. "Just a little hometown drama, Mongo. Handling it." His reply was instantaneous. "Roger that. Team sends its best. Need us to come pay anyone a visit? My in-laws are terrified of me." I let out a genuine laugh, the sound swallowed by the night. The thought of Mongo, all 6'5" and 250 pounds of solid muscle, showing up on my father's doorstep was both terrifying and hilarious. It was his way of saying, "We've got your back." Then, a second message came through. It was a video file. I hesitated for a second before tapping to open it. The screen flickered to life, revealing a cramped, dimly lit tent somewhere in the Middle East. Crowded together in front of the phone's camera were 7 familiar faces. They were exhausted, bearded, and covered in the dust of whatever godforsaken place they were in, but their grins were wide. "Hey, Skipper," they all yelled in a chaotic, overlapping chorus. "Heard you were going home to kick some ass in court." Mongo's face filled the screen. "Seriously, Captain, don't let them push you around. You're the baddest woman we know." Another one, Smitty, a young medic from Texas, pushed his way forward. "Ma'am, if you need a character witness, just say the word. I'll tell the judge about the time you pulled me out of that." The video cut out abruptly, probably due to a terrible satellite connection. The screen went black, but the image of their smiling, loyal faces was burned into my mind. I sat there on that cold wooden step, staring at the dark screen, and felt a warmth spread through my chest. Then a tear escaped, tracing a hot path down my cold cheek. Then another. These weren't tears of sadness or self-pity. They were tears of overwhelming gratitude. These men. They had seen me at my absolute worst, covered in mud, blood, and sweat. They had seen me make life-or-death decisions under fire. They trusted me with their lives, and I trusted them with mine. Here they were, halfway around the world in the middle of a real war, taking the time to send a goofy, supportive message to their commanding officer. The quiet of the farm was no longer heavy with loneliness. It was filled with the echo of their voices. My blood family hadn't called me in 12 years. My chosen family had reached out in less than 12 hours. The contrast was a punch to the gut, but it was the kind of punch that knocks the wind into you, not out of you. Family isn't just the blood you're born with. It's the people you're willing to bleed for. I took a deep, steadying breath, the crisp night air clearing my head. I was not an orphan. I was not alone. I stood up, patting Knox's solid head. "Come on, boy," I said, my voice steady and clear once more. "Let's get some sleep. We've got a big day tomorrow." Courtroom 3B of the Portsmouth Family Court was a small, airless box that smelled of old paper, floor wax, and the faint sour scent of other people's anxieties. The dark wood paneling seemed to absorb the light, and the room was thick with a nervous tension that you could almost taste. The moment I pushed open the heavy double doors and stepped inside, a wave of silence washed over the gallery. The low murmur of whispers and shuffling feet stopped instantly. Every head swiveled in my direction. My dress blue uniform, with its sharp, clean lines, gleaming gold buttons, and the silent, colorful story told by the ribbons on my chest, seemed to soak up all the sound and oxygen in the room. Across the aisle, I saw them. They were sitting in the front row, a united front of accusation behind their lawyer. My father, Robert, was crammed into his best suit, the dark gray one he wore to weddings and funerals. It was tight across his thick mechanic's shoulders, making him look even more rigid and uncomfortable. He met my gaze, and a cruel smirk twisted his lips before he let out a short, sharp chuckle. It wasn't a sound of humor. It was a sound of pure, bitter contempt, a public declaration of his disdain. My mother, Margaret, refused to look at me. Her attention was fixed on their lawyer, a nervous tick making her smooth the fabric of her floral Sunday dress. As I passed their row, I heard her whisper to him, her voice dripping with a familiar, weary shame. "It's ridiculous. She always has to make a scene." That whisper, though barely audible, struck me with the force of a physical blow. It was the same tone, the same sentiment she had used my entire life, the one that always asked, "Why can't you just be what we wanted?" I didn't react. I kept my chin up, my steps measured and even on the worn linoleum floor, and walked to the defendant's table. I sat, placing my single, neat folder of documents before me. The chair was hard, the solitude of the table feeling vast. Their lawyer, a portly man named Finch with a slick, condescending voice that grated on the nerves, heaved himself to his feet. He addressed the judge, a weary-looking man named Simmons, who looked like he'd seen every possible variation of human misery. "Your Honor," Finch began, his voice a smooth, oily performance of sympathy. "We are here today to address a deeply painful family tragedy. The defendant, Captain Elsie Bates," he paused, letting my rank hang in the air as if it were an accusation, "chose to abandon her family 12 years ago. She chose to pursue a certain lifestyle, a transient and dangerous career that has, shall we say, alienated her from her most basic filial responsibilities. She willfully abandoned the property left to her by her beloved grandfather, allowing it to fall into a state of shameful neglect, causing my clients, her loving parents, immeasurable emotional and financial distress. The performance was too much for my father. He shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. His face was a blotchy, furious red. "She ran off to play soldier," he roared, pointing a trembling, grease-stained finger directly at me. The gallery gasped. "That's all it ever was. A game. You think wearing that costume is gonna scare anyone? You're no daughter of mine. Mr. Bates, you will sit down and be silent, or I will have you removed." Judge Simmons's voice cracked through the room like a whip. My father, his chest heaving, glared at me one last time before sinking back into his seat, muttering under his breath. Mr. Finch didn't miss a beat. "As you can see, Your Honor, the emotions are very raw. Mrs. Bates, would you please take the stand?" My mother walked slowly, dabbing at her dry eyes with a pristine, folded tissue. She sat, arranged her skirt, and began to cry on cue. They were perfect, delicate sobs designed for maximum effect. "I tried," she wept, her voice cracking beautifully. "Oh, how I tried. I prayed every single night for her to come home, to just be a normal girl. Find a nice young man from town, settle down, give me grandchildren. But she changed. The military. It made her hard. Cold. She's not my little girl anymore. She's a stranger. Mrs. Bates, Finch said gently, in your opinion, did your daughter abandon the house? My mother looked up, her eyes glistening with manufactured tears. She looked at the judge, at the jury of faces in the gallery. Anywhere but at me. Yes, she said, her voice a pained whisper that carried to every corner of the room. She abandoned it, just like she abandoned us. She never comes home for Christmas. She didn't even call when her father was sick with pneumonia last year. We could have been on our deathbeds, and she wouldn't have known. I sat perfectly still, my back a rigid line, my hands clasped on the table. The lie about my father being sick stung the most. I remembered that call vividly, made from a satellite phone in a sand-swept tent in Yemen. The connection crackling, my voice hoarse from lack of sleep. I had called. She hadn't picked up. This was their strategy, a public execution of my character. Each word was a carefully aimed bullet. Abandoned. Not my daughter. Ridiculous. Cold. Stranger. The words hammered against the disciplined walls I'd built around my emotions. My training kicked in, a calm, cold voice cutting through the noise. Never let emotion dictate your actions. Observe, analyze, act. I focused on my breathing, a steady rhythm in and out. I pictured Mongo's goofy grin. I felt the phantom weight of my grandfather's compass in my hand. I kept my eyes fixed forward, not on my parents, but on the American flag standing in the corner. It was my anchor in this storm. Finally, Mr. Finch turned to the judge. The prosecution rests, Your Honor. A heavy silence settled once more. The air was thick with their accusations, their manufactured grief hanging like smoke. They had fired every shot in their arsenal. They had told their story. They had said their piece. Now it was my turn. When their lawyer smugly sat down, a thick, cloying silence filled the courtroom. It was heavy with their accusations, with the weight of their carefully crafted narrative. Judge Simmons, who had been listening with a kind of weary patience, adjusted the glasses on his nose and finally turned his full attention to me. His expression was impossible to read, a judge's neutral mask. Defendant, he said, his voice a flat, tired baritone that had probably presided over 1,000 family disputes just like this one. Do you wish to respond? Do you have legal counsel present? I took a slow, deliberate breath. In and out, the way I'd been trained. Then I pushed my chair back, the sound of its legs scraping against the floor the only noise in the room. I rose to my feet. Every whisper in the gallery died. Every eye was locked on me, a solitary figure in dark blue and gold. I do not require a lawyer, Your Honor, I said. My voice was calm, clear, and steady. I had trained for years to project commands across the chaos of a battlefield. The quiet of this courtroom was no challenge. And yes, I would very much like to respond. I kept my gaze fixed on the judge, on the raised dais that symbolized the law. They had made their appeal to emotion and pity. I would make my appeal to the facts. First, I began, my voice ringing with a formality they had never heard from me. For the record, my name is Captain Elsie Bates, United States Navy. I consciously put a slight emphasis on my rank, letting it hang in the air as a direct refutation of my father's sneering costume comment. I do not play soldier, as the plaintiff alleged. I serve. From the corner of my eye, I saw my father snort, a small, disgusted sound. I refused to look his way. His power in my life, his ability to diminish me with a single glance, ended today. He had commanded the stage for 12 years. His time was up. Regarding the central accusation of abandonment, I continued, my tone shifting deliberately into one of factual, almost clinical, reporting. I reached down and picked up the thick, 1-inch binder from my table. I would like to submit into evidence 12 years of property tax records for my grandfather's farm. I walked the few steps to the court clerk's desk and placed the binder down. I didn't slam it, but I didn't set it down gently, either. It landed with a solid, definitive thud that seemed to punctuate the silence. You will find, I said, addressing the judge again, that every payment has been made in full and on time via direct debit from my active duty salary account. Also in that folder are the fully paid invoices for a complete roof replacement I arranged and paid for in 2021, and for an emergency plumbing repair in the winter of 2023 when a pipe burst. I hired and paid the contractors for both jobs remotely, one from the deck of a destroyer in the Arabian Sea, the other using a satellite phone from a forward operating base whose location I am not at liberty to disclose. I paused, letting the tangible reality of those documents, the paper trail of my commitment, sink into the room. I may not have been physically present at the property, Your Honor. My duties often prevent that. But I have never, not for a single day, abandoned my responsibilities to it, just as I have never abandoned my responsibilities to this country. Then I turned my head slightly, my gaze finally falling upon my mother where she sat, looking small and frail in the witness stand. She flinched, her eyes wide, as if surprised that I would dare to look at her, to speak to her directly. My mother is correct about one thing, I said. I saw a flicker of triumphant confusion cross her face, thinking I was about to concede a point. I was not home when my father was sick, and I was not home for Christmas. I let her hold that small victory for a beat before I turned back to the judge and took it away. On Christmas Day of 2019, Your Honor, my team and I were stationed at a remote outpost in Yemen, securing a perimeter under constant threat. And in March of last year, when my father had pneumonia, I was a patient at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany, recovering from reconstructive surgery after an IED blast shattered my left knee. A low murmur went through the gallery. I continued, my voice remaining level, factual. I did, however, call. I called my mother from my hospital bed. She didn't pick up the phone. I paused, then added the final, quiet detail. Perhaps, I said, my voice as cold and sterile as the hospital I was describing, she didn't recognize the international country code. The color drained from my mother's face. It was a visible, shocking transformation. Her carefully constructed facade of the grieving, abandoned parent didn't just crack, it disintegrated. Her mouth fell open slightly. Her eyes, no longer wet with fake tears, were wide with the pure, stark terror of being caught in an undeniable lie. She knew. I knew she knew. It wasn't a missed call, it was a rejected one. I took one final, steadying breath, feeling a cold, controlled power moving through me. It wasn't rage anymore, it was clarity. Your Honor, I concluded, my voice even but unyielding. The truth is, I never abandoned that house, just as I never abandoned this family. The truth is, they abandoned me. They abandoned me 12 years ago, on the day I swore an oath to serve this nation instead of staying to work in my father's auto shop. They are not suing me today for a house. They are suing me because they are ashamed of me. Because my life, my service, is a reflection of a choice they cannot understand and will not respect. But the final truth, Your Honor, is that I am not ashamed of who I am. If you believe that speaking your truth, even when your voice shakes, is the ultimate form of strength, please hit that like button. And in the comments below, just type the words, I see you, to show your support for Elsie and for everyone who has ever had to fight to be seen. With that, I gave a slight formal nod to the judge. I turned, walked back to my table with measured steps, and sat down. The room was utterly, profoundly silent. After I sat down, the silence that followed was different. It was no longer just the absence of noise, it was a heavy, expectant void. Every person in that room, from the gallery to the plaintiff's table, was holding their breath, waiting for the judge to speak. Judge Simmons didn't say anything for what felt like a lifetime. He leaned back in his large leather chair, took off his reading glasses, and began to polish the lenses with a small, clean cloth from his breast pocket. It was a slow, methodical gesture. The kind of deliberate action a man takes when he is processing something profound. My parents and their lawyer exchanged confused, anxious glances. This wasn't going according to their script. They had expected me to break down, to cry, to yell, to give them more drama for their theater of victimhood. They hadn't expected the cold, hard weight of facts. They were unprepared for my calm. Finally, Judge Simmons put his glasses back on. He didn't look at my parents. He didn't look at their lawyer. He looked directly at me, and I saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. The weary, bureaucratic glaze was gone. In its place was a sharp, penetrating focus, an intensity that made me sit up even straighter. It was the look of a man who was no longer just presiding over a case. He was seeing through it. "Captain Bates," he said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that seemed to make the very air vibrate. "Where do you serve?" "Naval Special Warfare Development Group, sir," I replied, keeping my answer precise and formal. "I'm not at liberty to discuss operational details." He gave a slow, deliberate nod, as if my answer was exactly what he expected. "I'm not asking for operational details, Captain." His gaze drifted from my face down to the colorful ribbons arrayed on my chest. His eyes, trained by a past I couldn't have known, scanned them not as decorations, but as a language, a story. "That third one from the top," he said, his voice still low. "That's the Silver Star, is it not?" I was so stunned by the question I could only manage a quiet, "Yes, sir." At the plaintiff's table, I heard my father whisper harshly to my mother, "What the hell is a Silver Star?" She just shook her head, her face a mask of confusion. Judge Simmons ignored them completely. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench, his focus entirely on me. His next words were not for the court record, they were for me. But he spoke them with a voice that boomed through the silent courtroom. "Forgive my memory, Captain, but it's been a few years. Would you be the same Elsie Bates who was decorated for leading the evacuation of 43 American civilians from the embassy in Yemen back in 2019? The one who took a bullet to the leg while pulling the last of the diplomatic staff onto the helicopter?" The air in the room seemed to crystallize. Every sound stopped. The shuffling of feet, the clearing of throats, the rustle of paper, all of it ceased. You could have heard a pin drop on the worn carpet. I looked across the room at my parents. My mother's mouth was hanging open, her carefully applied lipstick suddenly looking garish. My father was frozen, the angry red in his face draining away, replaced by a ghastly pale shock. This story was a ghost to them. A headline they might have glanced at in a newspaper, a report they might have ignored on the evening news. They had never heard it. They had never asked. I couldn't find my voice for a moment. The sudden public acknowledgement of the single most defining and traumatic day of my career, here in this stuffy little courtroom, was disorienting. I swallowed hard and gave a short, single nod. "I was just doing my duty, Your Honor." A small, sad smile touched the corner of Judge Simmons's mouth. It was the first glimmer of warmth I had seen from him all day. "Captain," he said softly, "that is one hell of an understatement." Then, he turned. He physically rotated his entire chair to face my parents, and the warmth in his voice vanished, replaced by something cold and hard as forged steel. The weary judge was gone. In his place sat a man who was now personally invested. "Mr. and Mrs. Bates," he began, his voice dangerously quiet. "You have brought a petition before this court suing your daughter for the abandonment of a piece of property." He reached over and, without looking down, picked up the binder of evidence I had submitted. He held it up. "It seems that while she was busy making sure its taxes were paid, she was also, concurrently, busy saving the lives of 43 Americans. People who could have been your neighbors, your friends." He let the binder drop to the bench with a loud, echoing smack that made both of my parents jump. "While you were busy being ashamed of her," he said, his voice rising with a controlled, righteous anger, "the rest of this country—" He brought his hand down hard on the bench, the sound like a gavel strike. "Owes her a debt of gratitude." Judge Simmons wasn't finished. His words had stunned the courtroom into silence, but he wasn't just making a statement. He was driving a point home, ensuring the message was received with the force of a battering ram. He fixed his cold, hard gaze on my father. "Mr. Bates," he said, his voice now dangerously low and personal, "let me be perfectly clear. Your daughter is a hero, an actual, real-life American hero. A lot of us in this country talk about service. We fly flags on the 4th of July and we thank veterans for their service at the grocery store. Your daughter has lived it. She has bled for it." He made a small, sharp gesture towards me, towards the knee that still ached under my uniform. And you stand in this courtroom and you call her a disappointment? You call her service-playing soldier? My father's face, which had been pale with shock, began to turn a mottled red again, but this time it wasn't anger. It was the flush of profound public shame. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He just stared, utterly speechless, a man whose entire worldview had just been dismantled in front of him. The judge then turned his attention to their lawyer, Mr. Finch, who suddenly looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. "Counselor," Judge Simmons snapped, "do you have anything at all to say for your client's behavior?" The slick, confident lawyer was gone. In his place was a flustered, sweating man who couldn't meet the judge's glare. Your Honor," he stammered, shuffling his papers nervously. "My clients, they weren't aware of the specifics of their daughter's service." The judge exploded. "They weren't aware?" he roared, the sound blasting through the courtroom like a cannon shot. He surged to his feet, his black robes swirling around him, no longer a tired bureaucrat, but a towering figure of pure, righteous fury. "And why weren't they aware, Counselor? Because they never asked. Because they were so consumed with their own petty, wounded pride that they couldn't be bothered to find out that they had a daughter risking her life on the other side of the world, for the very freedoms that allow them to stand here and insult her." He stopped, breathing heavily, his face flushed. The entire room was frozen. Then, as quickly as it came, the fury receded. He sat back down, smoothed his robes, and became a judge once more, his voice returning to the calm, authoritative tone of legal procedure. "Under the statutes of the Commonwealth of Virginia," he said coolly, "a claim of property abandonment requires proof of complete and utter neglect, and an intent to relinquish all responsibility. The defendant has provided clear and indisputable evidence of ongoing financial upkeep, maintenance, and responsibility. Therefore, there is no legal basis whatsoever for this claim." He reached for his wooden gavel, his movements now deliberate and final. "The petition brought by the plaintiffs," Judge Simmons declared, his voice ringing with finality, "is hereby dismissed." He brought the gavel down. Crack. The sound was sharp and absolute. It wasn't just a noise, it felt like a physical event. A shockwave that seemed to shake the very foundations of the room, breaking the spell of 12 years of injustice. "Furthermore," he added, his voice cutting through the ringing silence, "I find that this lawsuit was filed frivolously, with malicious intent, and for the primary purpose of harassment. Therefore, the court orders that all of the defendant's legal fees, though she appears to have had the wisdom not to require any, shall be paid in full by the plaintiffs." He looked at me then, and the steel in his eyes softened for a moment. He gave me a slow, respectful nod. "Thank you for your service, Captain." And with that, he stood up and swept out of the courtroom through a side door, leaving a stunned and shattered silence in his wake. For a full second, nobody moved. It was as if time had stopped. Then, the spell broke. My father let out a strangled, incoherent roar of pure rage and slammed his fist into the back of the wooden bench in front of him. The sound of flesh hitting wood echoed in the quiet room. My mother finally broke down completely, her shoulders shaking with ragged, genuine sobs. These were not the fake tears from the witness stand. These were the bitter, ugly tears of absolute defeat. They had lost. They hadn't just lost a court case. They had been publicly stripped bare, their cruelty and selfishness laid out for the entire town to see. The weapon they had tried to use against me, this courtroom, had turned on them with devastating force. I watched them for a moment, and a strange thing happened. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel a rush of triumphant joy. The word that came to my mind was tired. I just felt tired and empty. The crushing weight I had been carrying on my shoulders for 12 years was suddenly gone, lifted by the judge's verdict. But its absence left a hollow space, a quiet ache where the burden used to be. I stood up, my movements feeling slow and heavy. I smoothed the front of my uniform jacket, a small automatic gesture of restoring order. And without a single backward glance, I turned and walked out of the courtroom, leaving the wreckage of my family behind me. I didn't go back to my apartment in Norfolk after the hearing. I drove straight to the farm, the silence in my truck a stark contrast to the emotional detonation I had just witnessed. I didn't change out of my uniform. I walked out onto the back porch, the same porch my grandfather had built, and sat on the steps, the dark wool of my jacket feeling heavy and formal in the quiet country air. I watched the sun dip below the tall pine trees, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and purple. Knox came and laid his head on my lap, his presence a warm, solid comfort. I had won. The verdict was clear, the victory, absolute. So why did I feel so hollow? The judge's gavel had shattered a 12-year curse of lies and accusations, but it couldn't magically heal the wounds underneath. Sitting there, in the quiet aftermath, a surprising realization settled over me. I had never truly wanted to humiliate them. I had never wanted to see them broken and exposed in a public courtroom. All I had ever wanted was for them to see me, to see the person I had become, not the disappointment they had imagined. For 12 years, I had carried the weight of their misunderstanding. I'd carried it on long marches, on covert missions, on the lonely decks of ships halfway around the world. It was a burden I'd grown so accustomed to, I almost didn't know who I was without it. Now it was gone, lifted from my shoulders by a stranger in a black robe, and I didn't know what to do with the sudden, terrifying lightness. A few days passed. I spent them at the farm, trying to reclaim the space, both physically and mentally. I started clearing the overgrown weeds from my grandmother's old flower beds, my hands raw from pulling up stubborn roots. It was mindless, physical work, a way to sweat out the lingering tension. I was wrestling with a particularly stubborn patch of ivy when the sound of a car engine made me look up. An old, familiar sedan was pulling into the driveway. It was my mother's. It was the first time she had set foot on this property in years. She got out of the car and stood there for a moment, looking not at me, but at the house itself. She looked older than I remembered, smaller. The anger and defiance from the courtroom had been replaced by a deep, weary sadness. "It looks better," she said, her voice quiet and hesitant. "You've been working on it." I didn't answer, just kept my hands buried in the dirt. She took a few tentative steps closer and held something out to me. It was an old photograph, the corners soft and curled, the colors faded to a warm sepia tone. It was a picture of me, maybe 5 years old, perched on my grandfather's strong shoulders, my face split by a wide, toothy grin. He was looking up at me, his expression one of pure, unadulterated pride. "He would have been so proud of you, Elsie," my mother said, her voice barely a whisper. I still didn't look at her. "Your father, he was just scared. You went to all those places. He was terrified of losing you. And for a man like him, that fear, it just turns into anger. It's the only way he knows how to feel anything." Finally, I looked up from the dirt, my gaze meeting hers. "Why are you telling me this now?" Her eyes, for the first time, looked haunted. "Because of what happened in court," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "The judge, he was right. We didn't know. We didn't know because we never asked." She took a shaky breath, as if the admission was a painful one. "Your father, after the news report about that rescue, he found it on YouTube. He watched it, over and over again. He never told anyone, not even me. I only found out because I saw the search history on the computer." My heart seemed to skip a beat. All this time, he knew. He knew who I was, what I had done. He had seen the proof of my life's work, but his stubborn, unyielding pride wouldn't let him acknowledge it. It was a secret he kept locked away. A silent, solitary act of watching the daughter he pretended not to have. "What do you want, Mom?" I asked, my voice flat. I needed to cut through the excuses, through the years of silence. She looked at me then, truly looked at me, her gaze steady. "This Sunday," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "Come over for dinner. I'll make your favorite, fried chicken." I just stared at her. The idea was so absurd, so jarringly normal after years of bitter estrangement. "I don't know," I said, my voice betraying nothing. "Please, Elsie," she pleaded, and for the first time I heard a crack in her composure. It was a sound of genuine desperation. "Your father, He'll be there. He, he agreed. It was the first olive branch offered in 12 years of frozen silence. I looked at her, and I no longer saw a monster. I saw a tired, frightened woman who had made a lifetime of wrong choices by always standing with her husband, even when he was wrong. She had followed him down a path of anger and resentment, and now she was standing alone at a dead end, trying to find her way back. "I'll think about it," I said. But as she got back in her car and drove away, leaving me alone in the quiet of the garden, I knew. Deep down, I already knew I would go. That Sunday, I went. As I drove to the small house I grew up in, a knot of apprehension tightened in my stomach. I had faced down enemy combatants with less anxiety. But this was a different kind of courage. It was the courage to be vulnerable, to accept the things I couldn't change, and to find the strength to change the things I could. When I chose my uniform that morning, I didn't reach for the formal dress blues. I also didn't reach for civilian clothes. I chose my service khakis, the standard, everyday uniform of a naval officer. It wasn't a declaration of war like the blues had been, nor was it a retreat into the anonymity of being just Elsie. It was a quiet statement of fact. This is who I am, every single day. This is me. I walked up to the front door and knocked before I could lose my nerve. My mother opened it, a nervous smile on her face. As I stepped inside, the familiar scent of fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and buttermilk biscuits filled the air. The smell of 1,000 Sunday dinners from a lifetime ago. My father was in the kitchen, standing awkwardly by the stove, out of place in his own home. He looked up as I entered. His eyes flickered over me, taking in the khaki uniform. And for a moment, I saw the old hardness in his face. But then, something shifted. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. "Come on in," he said, his voice a low grumble. "Chicken's almost ready." The air was thick with unspoken words, with 12 years of anger and hurt hanging between us. But it wasn't hostile anymore. It was just awkward. And for the first time, awkward felt like progress. We ate dinner in near silence, the only sounds the clinking of forks against plates. It wasn't comfortable, but it was a start. It was a shared meal, a truce declared over a plate of potatoes. After dinner, as I was helping my mother clear the dishes, my father spoke from the doorway. "Elsie, come out to the back porch for a minute." My mother froze, looking from him to me with wide, worried eyes. I gave her a small nod and followed him outside. We stood there in the fading evening light, the air cool against my skin. For a long moment, we just listened to the sound of the cicadas, the same sound I remembered from my grandfather's porch. "You did good," he finally mumbled, not looking at me, but out at the yard. "In court, I mean." "I just told the truth, Dad." He grunted, then reached into his worn jeans pocket and fumbled with something. He pulled his hand out and held an object out to me. It was small and heavy, its brass casing dulled with age. My breath caught in my throat. It was my grandfather's compass, not the one he had given me, but his own personal one, the one he had carried in his pocket every day, the one my father had kept for himself after he died. "He left this for me," my father said, his voice thick and raspy. "But I think it belongs to you now." He pushed it into my hand. "You? You earned it more than I did." I closed my fingers around the compass, its familiar weight a solid presence in my palm. This was it. Not an apology. He would probably go to his grave without ever saying the words, "I'm sorry." But this gesture, this surrender of a family heirloom, this admission of my worth, it was more powerful than any apology could ever be. He was relinquishing his claim not just on an object, but on the legacy of the man we both had loved. I opened the brass lid. There, inscribed on the inside, were my grandfather's words. "Honor is the one direction that never changes." I looked up at my father. He finally met my gaze, and in his eyes I saw not anger, but a deep, weary regret. He reached out an awkward, hesitant hand and placed it on my shoulder. His hand was heavy, calloused, and smelled faintly of motor oil. It was the first time he had touched me in a gesture of kindness since I was a little girl. "Don't be gone so long next time," he said gruffly. And that was it. Not forgiveness, not a magical healing of all wounds. It was something smaller and perhaps more real. It was acceptance. The war was over. The long, cold truce had begun. Over my next few shore leaves, I worked on the farm. I repaired the porch swing, planted a new garden, and gave the whole house a fresh coat of paint. And on the weekends, my father would drive out to help. He never said much. He'd just show up with his toolbox, and we'd work side by side in a comfortable, quiet rhythm of shared labor. Then, one Saturday, Ryan showed up too. He looked awkward and out of place, but he picked up a paintbrush and started working. We didn't talk about the lawsuit. We just painted. We ate dinner together on that newly painted porch, the three of us. For the first time in over a decade, we felt something like a family again. My story, the one from the courtroom, got out. I was invited to speak at my old high school for Veterans Day. I stood on the stage, in my uniform, and I spoke to the students about honor, about service, and about finding your own true north. That night, back on the porch at the farm, I held the compass in my hand. Beneath my grandfather's timeless inscription, I had carefully engraved a new line, a lesson learned in the crucible of my own life. It read, "Forgiveness is the truest form of discipline." I had found my direction. I had come home. Thank you for walking this path with me. My story isn't just about the family you're born into, but the honor you build for yourself. It's about finding your own true north, even when the world tries to convince you that you're lost. In the comments below, I'd be honored if you shared just one word that represents your true north, be it family, honor, peace, or freedom. If stories about resilience and the courage to define your own worth matter to you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. You are not alone on your journey.